I never expected my peaceful lakefront escape to become the center of a neighborhood standoff. But when your cabin sits just outside the invisible lines of an overreaching homeowners association run by a woman like Karen, trouble always seems to find you, even when you're just trying to grill some burgers in peace. My name is Marcus Whitaker, and while most people around here know me as the quiet guy with the boat and the friendly dog, what they don't know, what they tend to forget's that I also happen to be the chief of police for the entire county, a detail that becomes highly relevant when someone tries to muscle me into giving up my private property for a teenager's birthday bash. Before we get too far, if you're the kind of person who loves to see bullies get served a big steaming plate of justice, make sure to follow Sham Stories right now, because this one's going to make you cheer out loud by the end. It all started with a knock at my door on a Thursday afternoon, right as I was icing down a cooler of sodas and beer for the weekend. The weather was perfect, the air crisp, and the lake shimmering like a postcard. I'd taken a long weekend off from the station to spend time alone with my fishing gear, my golden retriever Rex, and maybe a few steaks on the grill. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Brent standing there, all 6 feet of teenage swagger wrapped in cargo shorts, a backward baseball cap, and that entitled grin he probably practiced in the mirror. Brent was Karen's son, a 19-year-old community college dropout who seemed to believe that his mother's status as HOA president gave him lordship over everyone else's property. He looked at me with barely restrained amusement and said, "Hey, Officer Whitaker. My mom said your place would be perfect for my birthday party this Saturday. Big space, right on the lake, way better than the clubhouse. We'll just need it from like noon till midnight." I blinked slowly, thinking it had to be a joke. "Excuse me?" I asked. "You want to use my cabin for a party?" Brent nodded like it was already settled. "My mom said you don't really use it that often, and the HOA board agrees that it's kind of selfish to let such a prime spot go to waste when the community could enjoy it." That last part made me narrow my eyes. The HOA board doesn't have jurisdiction over my property. Brent, my cabin isn't part of the association, and I never signed the deed rider that puts me under Karen's rules. He shrugged, as if none of that mattered. "Well, the party's happening either way. My friend's already ordered a DJ setup. We're gonna have some floats and bonfire stuff, and maybe a pontoon cruise. It'll be chill." I leaned against the doorframe, my cop instincts kicking in. You step 1 foot onto my land without my permission, and it won't be chill. It'll be trespassing. Understand? Brent's smirk faltered slightly, but only for a second. "My mom says you're just being grumpy. She said the community has a right to share the shoreline." I was tempted to laugh, but instead I nodded politely and said, "Message received. You can go now." He left with a muttered, "Whatever, dude," and I shut the door, my mind already processing all the ways this could go sideways. That evening, I reviewed my security camera footage from previous weekends and decided to add 2 more wireless cameras, one on the back trail that led to the HOA dock and one angled toward the side gate, just in case Brent decided to get clever. I also called my deputy and let him know I might need backup for a potential disturbance Saturday night. It's just off-duty and informal. He laughed and said, "You finally going to arrest Karen?" I replied, "Not yet, but her boy's about to test how far the law stretches." Friday was quiet. Too quiet. No new messages, no flyers posted on my mailbox, no HOA notices pretending to be legally binding. But on Saturday morning, around 9, I saw movement through my binoculars. Brent and a few friends were unloading boxes from the back of a pickup truck into the common area just a few hundred feet from my cabin. They were hauling large speakers, plastic tubs of drinks, and several foldable tables with colorful tablecloths. The gall of it all amazed me. I walked over to the edge of my property line and called out, "This is your one warning. Keep everything off my land or I press charges." Brent just waved me off like a pesky bird. "We're staying on common." "Ground!" he shouted. "Relax, dude." I went back inside and started documenting. Took photos, logged timestamps, and even narrated a short video walkthrough of my boundary lines with my badge visible in the shot. Then I waited. By 2 in the afternoon, there were over 30 people gathered on the shoreline. Music thumping and Brent strutting around with a megaphone. I watched through the blinds, noting that 2 portable toilets had been wheeled in and that someone had started setting up a slip-and-slide that crept dangerously close to my deck. I put on my field jacket with my badge clipped to the chest, walked out, and approached Brent. "Take it all down now." He turned with an exaggerated sigh. "Dude, this is public fun. Why are you always so uptight? This is not public. You're encroaching on my private land. This time I'm pressing charges." I pulled out my phone and dialed dispatch. "This is Chief Whitaker. I've got an active trespass situation. Please send a marked unit to Lakeview Cabin Sector 12. Brent's face drained of color. "Wait, you're serious?" I nodded. "Dead serious. Your mother knows better, and so should you. You want a party? Do it legally, on your own land, not mine." 10 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but siren off. Officer Daniels stepped out, looked around, and raised his eyebrows. "That's a lot of party for a neighborhood lake," he muttered. Brent tried to run damage control, saying it was just a misunderstanding, that the line was blurry, and they were just having fun. But I had the video, the evidence. The GPS-tagged camera footage, showing where their equipment had clearly crossed into my land. Officer Daniels handed out a few citations and warned the rest to leave or risk detainment. Most of them cleared out fast, mumbling and grumbling. Brent glared at me like I'd just ruined his life, but I didn't flinch. "This is what happens when you think rules don't apply to you," I said. "Next time, don't assume someone's silence means consent." Karen never showed her face that day, but the emails started arriving that night blaming me for ruining a special day, for intimidating young people, and even for making the community feel unsafe. I replied to none of them, because I knew this wasn't over. Karen was going to retaliate, and when she did, I'd be ready. Want to know how a petty HOA queen tried to push back and how I brought her whole fake empire crashing down? The fallout from Brent's failed Lakeside Bash was more intense than I had expected, even after years of dealing with people who thought they were untouchable. The emails came in first nasty, finger-pointing, full of buzzwords like overreach, abuse of authority, and personal vendetta. Most of them were anonymous, sent through some generic HOA communications platform, but I could tell Karen was behind them. Her writing style was hard to miss, formal but passive-aggressive, full of twisted logic and condescending as a sermon from a soapbox. I ignored them for the most part, but I made a folder for every one and started cataloging the dates, times, and content. A couple days after the party, I got a call from one of my fellow officers who worked traffic detail in the neighboring township. He told me he'd pulled over a black SUV with expired plates. Turns out it was registered under a shell corporation tied to Karen's brother, and the vehicle had a HOA logo on the rear window. She was now apparently funding personal errands through association resources. I thanked him, logged the info, and added it to the growing folder. The real shift came when I noticed strange vehicles circling my cabin during the week, different makes and models, mostly sedans with tinted windows. They weren't from the county, and they weren't locals. My cameras picked up some of the plates, and I traced 2 back to a private investigations firm out of state. Karen had hired someone to dig into me, probably to find dirt, or to create some illusion of wrongdoing she could leverage to turn the neighborhood against me. That move confirmed it. She wasn't just angry, she was out for revenge. But she had no idea that I'd already started a quiet investigation of my own. I wasn't looking for dirt, just the truth. What I found was even uglier than I had imagined. Karen's entire presidency was built on fear and lies. She had bullied residents into silence, imposed bogus rules, charged illegal fines, and even redirected community funds to family-run vendors. I had evidence now: check payments, invoices, audio clips from town meetings, where she twisted facts to sway votes. It was a web of manipulation spun so tightly that most people didn't even realize they were caught in it. To change, I scheduled a private meeting with 4 residents I trusted, people I knew weren't part of Karen's inner circle. I laid everything out for them, from Brent's trespassing to the surveillance footage to the misused funds. Their jaws dropped as the truth unfolded. One of them, a quiet man named Leo, who ran the neighborhood maintenance committee, nearly broke down in tears when he saw the invoices Karen had filed under his name, ones he never authorized. That meeting set everything in motion. Word spread. Quietly at first, neighbors whispered over fences, exchanged stories on dog walks, compared notes. What had once been individual frustration began to take the shape of collective outrage. Karen, oblivious, doubled down on her public image, began posting HOA newsletters filled with exaggerated claims of restoring order and rebuilding community trust. Her tone grew more dramatic by the day, like she was trying to rally her remaining supporters before the tide turned. But the more she pushed, the more people pushed back. A woman named Denise, who had been fined nearly $400 for placing a potted plant too close to her driveway, printed out the HOA bylaws and highlighted every section that Karen had violated. She mailed copies to every resident with a note attached. Read the rules she doesn't want you to know. Another resident, an Army veteran named Travis, started a neighborhood petition to audit the HOA's finances. It got over 50 signatures in 3 days, and the pressure mounted fast. Then came the night of the board meeting, the one where Karen planned to announce new security enhancements to protect against internal threats. It was obvious she meant me, but she underestimated how fed up the community had become. Over 100 people showed up, filling the small clubhouse to capacity and spilling out into the lawn. Karen stood at the podium, trying to maintain her usual superiority, but her voice wavered. "We are facing unprecedented hostility from individuals who believe they are above our community values," she said, scanning the crowd like she expected applause. None came. I waited near the back, letting others speak first. People told stories, fines, threats, inspections without notice. HOA checks written to companies with no websites or contact numbers. Finally, I stepped forward. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the evidence, the fake vendor records, the unfiled annexation documents, the footage from Brent's party showing clear trespassing. Then I showed the screen captures from Karen's private investigator parked outside my home. "This isn't just bad leadership," I said. "This is harassment, embezzlement, and abuse of authority, and I won't stand for it." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a slow clap started near the front of the room. It spread like fire until nearly the whole room was applauding. Karen tried to respond, but someone from the crowd shouted, "You're done, Karen." Another voice added, "We want to vote now." And just like that, the meeting turned into a referendum. A motion was filed to suspend Karen, pending a formal investigation. The vote passed by a landslide. She stormed out without a word, red-faced and trembling, her son trailing behind her like a ghost of his former cocky self. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen still had connections. She still had secrets buried, and she wouldn't go down quietly. What came next would test just how deep her corruption went and how far I'd have to go to make things right. The morning after the meeting, I woke up to find a long scratch carved across the driver's side of my truck and a small plastic HOA violation notice stuck under my windshield wiper with a pushpin. The kind Karen used to send out when she still felt in control. The violation read, "Unauthorized exterior lighting." Even though my porch lamp had been county approved for years and was set on a dusk two-dawn timer, it wasn't about the light. It was a message, a petty slap on the wrist to remind me that she wasn't out of the game yet. I sighed, took pictures of the damage, and filed a report. A part of me wanted to laugh at how childish it all felt. Like a high school queen be throwing tantrums now that the throne was crumbling. But I also knew better than to underestimate her. Karen was dangerous when cornered, and desperate people did stupid things. I called in a favor with a friend at the local bank who owed me for helping his daughter out of a bad domestic situation a few years back. I asked if he could look into the HOA's accounts. Nothing invasive, just flag anything strange, he promised. To get back to me discreetly. While I waited, the community transformed in ways I never expected. With Karen temporarily suspended, her vice president, a mild-mannered dentist named Royce, stepped in as acting chair. Roy had never wanted the position, but agreed to keep the board functioning while the investigation unfolded. Transparency opened the HOA books for public review and invited any homeowner to attend meetings without notice or agenda constraints. People showed up. People spoke. And for the first time in years, people actually smiled when they walked through the neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes past my cabin without parents pulling them back like I was some recluse or threat. I got invited to a community picnic. It felt like healing. But the deeper we dug into the HOA's records, the uglier it got. My friend from the bank called me late one night, whispering like he didn't want the walls to hear. "There's a separate account," he said, "set up under a shell name tied to a landscaping business that doesn't exist. Tens of thousands in transfers from HOA funds over the past 2 years." I felt my stomach turn. Tens of thousands? I repeated, "Yeah? And it looks like some of that money was laundered through fake invoices for community beautification projects, ones that never happened." I thanked him, hung up, and called Roy. We met in my cabin an hour later. I was poring over documents under the dim light of my kitchen. The kind of tense silence between us, only broken by the flipping of pages and the occasional curse. Roy was stunned. "She told us all the spending was budget approved," he said. "Said it was for HOA compliance upgrades." "Wow, it was for Karen," I replied. "For Brent, for whatever side projects they were funding with stolen money." We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Roy announced a full HOA audit and brought in a third-party forensic accountant. That move sent Karen into a public meltdown. She posted a rambling Facebook video accusing the board of betrayal, calling me a rogue cop, and claiming the audit was a smear campaign orchestrated by radical elements. The post was shared around town, but instead of winning her support, it backfired. Comment after comment condemned her, reminded her of the fines, the harassment, the lies. People were done, but Brent wasn't. One afternoon, I came home to find him waiting on my porch. He had his arms folded, and his face was twisted with the kind of anger only born from privilege finally meeting resistance. "You ruined everything," he spat. "You humiliated my mom." I stood my ground. "Your mom did that to herself. Was trying to fix this community. You turned everyone against her. She stole from this community. I helped it see the truth." Brent pointed a finger at me. "You'll pay for this. You think your badge makes you untouchable?" "No," I said quietly. "My integrity." He stomped off, but I knew that wasn't the end. Sure enough, a week later, I received notice that Karen was filing a defamation lawsuit against me. Roy and 3 other board members, her claim? Emotional distress, character damage, and economic hardship due to false allegations. The lawsuit was weak, based on no real evidence, but it forced us to lawyer up. The neighborhood rallied. A GoFundMe was started by Denise and Travis to help cover legal fees. Within 2 days, it had more than enough. Karen underestimated just how united everyone had become. During the deposition phase, the forensic accountant's report landed on my desk, and it was a bombshell. Not only had Karen embezzled nearly $70,000, but there were also wire transfers to accounts in her maiden name. Money used to pay off Brent's gambling debts, and even a deposit on a boat registered out of state. The board immediately submitted the report to the district attorney. Subpoenas were issued. Karen's lawsuit was dropped before it even reached court. Now the state was involved. It wasn't about HOA power anymore. It was about criminal theft, fraud, and abuse of position. One night I stood on my dock watching the reflection of the moon dance across the water when Roy called. "Tada. Wants to bring charges," he said. "They're asking if you'd be willing to testify." "I already have," I told him. "I've been doing it since the day she tried to take my land." The community watched as Karen's empire finally collapsed. Her house went dark. Brent moved in with a cousin out of town. The board appointed a new president, a retired teacher with no agenda, no ego, just a desire to help people live in peace. I got my lake back. But even then, I knew Karen had one more card to play. Something in her silence told me this story wasn't over. What she did next would shock everyone and nearly bring the entire case crashing down. The silence from Karen's side of the street didn't last long. And just as I had feared, it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. About 2 weeks after the district attorney's office announced the start of formal proceedings, a bizarre rumor began circulating through the neighborhood that I had been under internal investigation for misuse of authority, harassment, and even threats of violence against a fragile older woman just trying to serve her community. The claims were so specific and absurd that I knew immediately who had planted them. Karen had finally weaponized what she had left lies. I thought about ignoring the rumors, letting the legal process do its job, but as more residents approached, me with concerned questions and sideways glances, I realized I had to address it head-on. I called a meeting at the community center, not an official HOA gathering, but an open-door session where any neighbor could come hear directly from me. When the day came, the place was packed. Karen didn't show, of course, but her allies did, seated at the back, their arms crossed and their expressions smug. I stood at the front with a stack of documents, a slideshow, and a simple message. I've always done my job by the book, and I have nothing to hide. For the next hour, I walked everyone through the real story, my involvement with the HOA investigation, the timeline of Brent's trespassing, the security footage, the financial records from the third-party audit, and even the district attorney's letter confirming the criminal case against Karen. I showed my own personnel file from the police department clean, not a single mark of misconduct. The room was quiet when I finished, but then something happened that I didn't expect. A woman I didn't recognize stood up near the back. She was in her late 50s, thin, with neatly styled hair and nervous hands clutching a worn leather purse. "I used to work for Karen," she said softly. "I cleaned her house once a week for nearly 2 years. I didn't say anything before, because she threatened to sue me if I talked, but now I think people need to know. You could have heard a pin drop. She used HOA money to buy furniture," the woman continued. "She paid me cash sometimes, but other times she made me take HOA checks and just put office cleaning on the memo. But I never cleaned any. Office, it was always her house. I have copies of some of the checks still. I kept them. ... just in case." That confession turned the tide again. Following week, her checks were submitted to the DA's office and new charges were added. To Karen's case, Brent tried damage control online, posting vague videos and rants about cancel culture, but nobody was buying it. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet, Karen still had one last desperate move in her. One evening, just as the sun was sinking, behind the lake, I returned from a long walk with Rex to find a black sedan idling near my driveway. Inside was a man in a suit who introduced himself as a private attorney. "Miss Karen Whitlow is offering a settlement," he said. "She's willing to admit partial fault and pay restitution to the HOA in exchange for a formal public statement from you, retracting your claims of criminal behavior." I laughed, not out of amusement but sheer disbelief. "You do realize the DA has already filed charges, right?" I asked. "She can't negotiate with me. She's being prosecuted by the state." The attorney shrugged. "She believes your statement could sway public opinion and perhaps even mitigate sentencing." "Then she should have thought of that before. She used HOA funds like her own piggy bank," I replied. "Tell her the answer's no." We left without further protest, and I made sure the conversation was captured on my cabin's front-facing camera. It's just another file to add to the archive. But that same night, someone slashed the tires on my boat trailer and threw a brick through the back window of my cabin. No note, no spray paint, just chaos, rage, and cowardice. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. I filed another report, replaced the glass, and added 2 more cameras to the property. The message was clear. If Karen couldn't win legally, she would lash out in the shadows. But the harder she tried, the more isolated she became. At the next HOA meeting, where an official vote was held to permanently bar her from holding any leadership position, nearly every seat was filled. Roy presided with calm authority, and when the motion passed unanimously, the room broke into applause. It was more than just a vote, it was closure. Or so we thought. Because just a few days later, something happened that nearly unraveled everything. A new letter arrived in mailboxes, printed on fake HOA letterhead, claiming that the board's actions were invalid and that Karen had been reinstated by an emergency vote. It instructed residents to ignore the audit, stop paying dues to the interim board, and prepare for a return to proper governance. It was a bold, desperate act of impersonation. But what Karen didn't count on was that I had already spoken to the Postmaster General about previous mail tampering complaints. When this fraudulent letter surfaced, I called him again and delivered copies within 48 hours. A federal postal inspector showed up on Karen's doorstep with a warrant for mail fraud and obstruction. The look on her face, I was told, was one for the history books. But this wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about setting a precedent that no one, no matter how entitled, how manipulative, or how entrenched in a community, could rise above accountability forever. The legal wheels were fully in motion now. Charges were stacked, new victims stepped forward, and the neighborhood had tasted freedom. But as satisfying as it all was, I knew that justice still had a few steps left. Two Clement, the most dramatic ones, were just ahead. The courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial, a surprisingly warm spring morning that felt too peaceful for the storm brewing inside. The gallery filled quickly with neighbors, reporters, and even a few HOA board members past and present. All gathered to witness the fall of the woman who had ruled the community like a petty tyrant. Karen arrived in a navy blue suit that looked too polished for someone facing nearly a dozen charges, flanked by two attorneys and trailing just behind her sulking son, Brent, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. I sat quietly, behind the prosecution bench, not in uniform, but present as a witness and the man whose property had triggered the unraveling of Karen's long reign of entitlement. The first few hours were procedural jury selection, opening arguments, and introductions of evidence the prosecution planned to present. But by the second day, the real fireworks began. The lead prosecutor, a sharp and seasoned woman named Melissa Trent, started with the easiest target, the paper trail. She walked the jury through invoices that had been doctored, checks issued to non-existent companies, and vendor contracts signed with Karen's maiden name. The documents spoke louder than any witness ever could. By the third day, witnesses took the stand. Leo, the maintenance manager, was first. He described how he had been pressured into signing off on landscaping work that never occurred. Denise came next, producing printed HOA newsletters with false claims about rule changes that allowed Karen to fine homeowners arbitrarily. Then came the housekeeper, brave and composed as she detailed how she had been paid from HOA funds for private house cleaning and was told to keep quiet, lest she wanted trouble. Each testimony added another stone to the pile that would eventually crush Karen's defense, and yet through it all, she sat stiffly in her chair, her expression locked in that familiar cocktail of superiority and victimhood, as if she still couldn't believe the world had turned on her. But it was Brent's testimony that stunned everyone. Called by the prosecution under subpoena, he shuffled to the witness stand with reluctance etched across his face. When asked to state his relationship to the defendant, he muttered, "She's my mother," in a tone that made it clear he no longer took pride in saying so. Melissa started gently, asking about his role in the lake cabin incident. Brent rolled. His eyes called it a misunderstanding and downplayed everything. But then she brought out the party flyers copies pulled from his public social media pages, long with receipts from the DJ rental and text messages where he'd told friends the HOA basically gave him the cabin for the weekend. Brent's face turned red, then white. He mumbled something about bad judgment. When asked directly whether his mother knew he intended to use the property, he paused for a long time before saying, "She told me not to ask permission." "Just do it," said Marcus would come around. Marcus, Melissa asked. "You mean Chief Whitaker?" Brent swallowed. "Yeah." The slip was huge. Proved intent, coordination, and false belief of control, everything the prosecution needed to tie Karen directly to the trespass, misuse of authority, and retaliation against me. But Brent wasn't done. In a move no one saw coming, he sighed deeply and added, "And yeah, she used HOA money for a lot of things. Furniture, boat down payment, even paid off one of my credit cards. I didn't ask where the money came from. I figured it was hers." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Karen visibly flinched. Her lawyer stood immediately, objecting to the last statement, but it was too late. The jury had heard it. Her own son had turned the key in the lock that sealed her fate. The rest of the trial moved faster after that. The defense tried to paint Karen as a misunderstood leader, overwhelmed by responsibility and let down by those around her. They tried to deflect blame onto Brent, the vendors, even the board itself, but the jury wasn't buying it. And neither was the judge. I was called to testify near the end. I described the events leading up to Brent's unauthorized party, my property boundaries, the trespassing, and the escalation after worker-ins' attempts to discredit me, the fake violation notices, the PI surveillance. I kept my tone even, professional, and stuck to facts. Melissa didn't need me to be dramatic. The evidence spoke for itself. During cross-examination, Karen's defense tried to imply I had a vendetta. "Would you say you had personal animosity toward Ms. Whitlow?" the attorney asked. "No," I replied plainly. "But I did have a professional responsibility to uphold the law, and she broke it repeatedly. Isn't it true you were once denied an exception to HOA regulations regarding fencing on your property?" he continued. I nodded. "Yes," and I complied. That's the difference. The final arguments came a week later. Melissa reminded the jury that leadership is not immunity, that entitlement is not legality, that community service doesn't erase criminal behavior. Karen's defense leaned on emotional appeal, asking for leniency for a mother trying her best. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the room was silent. The foreperson read aloud, "Guilty on all counts." Karen slumped in her chair, finally stripped of the icy composure she had worn like armor for so long. Brent looked like he might vomit. The judge sentenced her to 2 years of probation, 18 months of house arrest, mandatory restitution to the HOA, and a lifetime ban from holding any governance role in any community association. She walked out in handcuffs, her eyes darting around the courtroom, looking for someone to blame. No one met her gaze. The chapter on Karen's rule had closed. But what came after was even more remarkable. After Karen's conviction and the image of her being let out in handcuffs spread quietly but effectively throughout the county, the atmosphere in the neighborhood underwent a transformation so profound it felt like we had all come out from under a storm cloud. The air at HOA meetings was lighter, the conversations more civil, and for the first time in years people began to believe in the idea of community again. With the board reorganized and Roy officially voted in as president, transparency and fairness became more than words, they became the backbone of every decision made. One of Roy's first actions was to form an independent audit committee made up of residents who had professional experience in accounting, law, and public administration. They combed through every expense, every vote, and every policy that Karen had touched during her time in power, and what they uncovered was both appalling and validating. From overcharging for lawn services that were never rendered to levying unjust fines on homeowners who couldn't afford to fight back, Karen's tactics had always been about control. The new board made it a point to reverse every unjust penalty, refund thousands of dollars to those she had wronged, and open a line of communication where residents could express grievances without fear of retaliation. People who had once stayed silent, some out of fear, others out of resignation, began to speak up. A retired couple who had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp told their story at the first town hall. A single mother who was harassed over the size of her children's outdoor toys shared how she had nearly sold her home to escape the scrutiny. Now, instead of hiding in shame, they found allies among their neighbors. The ripple effect of that accountability extended far beyond the boundaries of our community. News of the trial and Karen's conviction made local headlines, and I was invited to speak at a regional HOA ethics conference where I laid out the case from beginning to end, focusing not just on her crimes, but on the danger of unchecked power in small communities. The reception was overwhelming. I met HOA board members from towns I'd never heard of, all with their own Karen stories, some worse than ours. Many asked for advice, for resources, even for copies of the forensic audit reports we had used to finally hold Karen accountable. I realized then that what we'd gone through wasn't just about one corrupt woman and her spoiled son. It was about systemic issues and how power is handed out in neighborhood governance without oversight. So I began compiling everything: reports, audio recordings, statements, meeting minutes, all into a document we called the Karen Playbook. We made it public. Within months, it had been downloaded hundreds of times, referenced in multiple community forums, and even cited by a state senator pushing for HOA reform legislation. Back home, things kept getting better. Brent, after testifying and essentially sealing his mother's conviction, vanished from the neighborhood, some said. He moved to Florida. Others said he was living in his aunt's basement trying to start over. I didn't care. I wasn't out for revenge. I just didn't want him around poisoning what we were trying to rebuild. In his absence, the lake became a place of laughter again. Kids swam, families barbecued, and every so often, someone would stop by my cabin. To thank me not because I was a cop, but because I had stood up when others were too afraid to. That meant more to me than any badge ever could. But not all the scars healed easily. One day I found a letter in my mailbox with no return address. It simply said, "You think you're a hero, but you just turned neighbors into enemies." I handed it over to Roy, who added it to the security logs, and while I didn't feel threatened, it was a reminder that not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Some of Karen's supporters still nursed their resentment quietly, and while they had no power anymore, their bitterness clung to them like a shadow. But even shadows shrink when the light grows stronger. Roy introduced new bylaws that required term limits, budget transparency, and resident voting on all major decisions. We held workshops on homeowners' rights, brought in mediators for disputes, and organized regular community events where people could just enjoy each other's company. Slowly, the cabin that had once been the center of a bitter power struggle became the symbol of what we had overcome. I kept the boat dock in better condition than ever and often invited neighbors to launch their kayaks or fish from the edge. Where Karen had tried to build walls, we built bridges. Still, I never let my guard down entirely. A couple of times, I spotted unfamiliar cars parked too long near my cabin, but nothing ever came of it. Karen was still under probation, restricted from leaving the county without permission, but I wouldn't have put it past her to find some way to keep tabs on me. Not that it mattered. She no longer had the tools to cause harm, and I had the entire neighborhood behind me. One night, we held a lakeside movie screening, and over 200 people showed up. Families spread blankets across the grass, food trucks lined the edge of the cul-de-sac, and kids ran around with glow sticks. It was a moment I would have never imagined during Karen's range. Joy, unity, laughter, without fear. As the credits rolled on the movie and people packed up to head home, Roy approached me with a look of quiet satisfaction. Hard to believe. "This is the same place," he said. I nodded. Sometimes the worst storms wash away what needs to go. The impact of Karen's scandal stretched far beyond our peaceful lakeside community, rippling out into surrounding towns and even catching the attention of state officials who had long turned a blind eye to HOA abuses. What began as a neighborhood rebellion against corruption soon evolved into a larger movement for reform, and our town found itself at the center of something none of us had anticipated: a legislative push to bring real oversight to homeowners. Associations across the state. It started with a visit from State Senator Carolyn Marks, who requested a private meeting with Roy, myself, and several of the homeowners who had suffered under Karen's rule. She arrived without an entourage, dressed plainly in a gray blazer and jeans, and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow notepad, scribbling details as each of us shared our experiences. Some stories were heartbreaking, others infuriating, but all of them painted the same picture. Unchecked power in the hands of petty tyrants was a recipe for disaster. The senator was particularly struck by the evidence we provided: the doctored invoices, fake citations, stolen funds, and stories of targeted harassment. She asked if we'd be willing to testify at the upcoming Oversight Committee hearings, and we all agreed. Within 2 weeks, Roy and I drove down to the state capitol, where we took the floor in front of a packed room. Cameras rolled, reporters scribbled notes, politicians leaned forward in their seats. Roy went first, delivering a steady, heartfelt statement about how trust had been broken and what transparency had done to restore it. Then I followed, laying out the story from my perspective as both a homeowner and a law enforcement officer. I explained the danger of power without accountability and how Karen's personal vendetta nearly tore a community apart. By the time we finished, even the most jaded committee members looked rattled. Senator Marks thanked us, promised action. And within a month, introduced the Community Governance and Oversight Act, legislation designed to bring all HOAs under mandatory audit cycles, financial transparency laws, and resident Bill of Rights protections. The bill gained traction quickly, and not just because of our testimony other neighborhoods, inspired by our case, began coming forward with their own horror stories. One couple from 3 counties over had been evicted over a mailbox-colored dispute. Another man had been fined $200 a day for planting wildflowers instead of HOA-approved grass. The stories poured in, and public opinion swung hard. News stations dubbed it the Karen Reform Bill, and even national outlets began picking up the story. Back at home, we watched the news together at the community center, cheering when the bill passed unanimously through the state Senate. When the governor signed it into law, our neighborhood held a celebration. Food trucks, music, speeches from Roy and other board members. It was more than a party. It was a victory for every quiet homeowner who'd ever been bullied into silence. And while the larger world moved forward with reform, our little lake community solidified the changes we had started. Roy introduced digital voting to make board elections fairer, and we created a mediation board made up of volunteers to help resolve disputes before they escalated. We even established a Karen clause in the bylaws, a humorous but very real amendment that prohibited any board member from issuing fines or citations without a formal board-approved vote. But despite all the progress, the memory of Karen lingered like a stubborn ghost. Every once in a while, someone would mention her name during a meeting, and the room would shift, not out of fear anymore, but a kind of wary reflection like we all understood that power corrupts quickly when no one is watching. I was still the chief of police, still patrolling the town, still maintaining my cabin by the lake. But now, I was more than just a local officer. I was seen as the guy who stood up when it counted. I received letters from people I'd never met, some thanking me for the work we did, others sharing their own experiences and asking for advice. I tried to respond to every one of them, not because I needed praise, but because I knew what it felt like to stand alone against a system and wonder if anyone cared. And in the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. An old friend from my police academy days reached out. His name was Davis, and he now worked for a federal task force specializing in municipal fraud and abuse. He had read about the case, followed the legislative fallout, and said, "You know, Marcus, what you did down there is exactly what we need more of." Ever thought about working on something bigger? I hadn't, not really. My roots were deep in that community, and after everything we'd been through, I wasn't eager to leave. But Davis wasn't talking about leaving. He was talking about building. "We've been wanting to launch a pilot program," he said. "A unit that helps communities investigate local governance abuse, OZAs, town councils, school boards. You'd train people, guide them through how to document, report, and rebuild. You'd stay where you are, but your work would ripple out to hundreds of places that need someone like you." I told him I'd think about it, and I did. At night, sitting on my dock, listening to the quiet lap of the lake against the shore, I thought about what it would mean to help others stand up like we had. I thought about all the Karens out there, not just in HOAs, but everywhere, people who used authority as a weapon instead of a responsibility. I thought about the terrified homeowners, the families forced out, the elderly fined into bankruptcy. And I realized something important. We hadn't just survived Karen. We had exposed a flaw in the system. And now we had the chance to fix it on a much larger scale. So I called Davis back, said yes. The news broke on a Monday morning like a thunderclap. A national investigative documentary series had picked up our HOA case for a full-length special on abuses of neighborhood power. The producers had interviewed dozens of people, victims of corrupt boards, experts in community law, state officials pushing reform, and, of course, members of our own lakeside community. When the preview trailer dropped, it showed drone footage of our lake, panning over the cabins, and cut 2 sound bites from Roy, Denise, myself, and even the housekeeper who had helped seal Karen's fate. I'll admit, it was strange seeing our story projected so broadly. What had started as a petty abuse of HOA power over a cabin and a spoiled party boy had grown into a movement with momentum. That week, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Karen was summoned to federal court. The postal inspector's findings from the fraudulent letter scheme and the financial evidence that had bled into interstate vendor contracts pushed her case beyond the local courts. Now, she faced federal charged mail fraud, financial misconduct, and criminal impersonation of governance authority. The courtroom was different this time, more formal, more serious. No local reporters, these were national cameras, federal prosecutors, and a tone that said, "This time, you don't walk out in house arrest." I wasn't required to testify again, but I went anyway. I sat in the gallery in a plain blue shirt, blending in with the quiet crowd of people whose lives had once been twisted by the whims of one woman's entitlement. Brent did not appear. Rumor had it he'd severed all ties and was somewhere in Arizona selling used cars. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her once glossy demeanor worn thin, her hands trembling slightly each time new evidence was presented. The most damning came from the audit firm we'd used. An independent analyst traced every misused HOA dollar to 3 personal accounts, 2 in her name and 1 under a Shell LLC registered to Brent. Emails confirmed she'd coordinated payments for personal use, then filed those payments under community enhancement fees. There was no longer a gray area. This was theft, manipulation, and fraud. The judge's verdict was decisive. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 3. She was ordered to pay full restitution and banned from holding any leadership position in any association, nonprofit, or community program nationwide for the rest of her life. When she was escorted out in handcuffs a second time, the world finally saw her for what we had always known, a manipulator who mistook control for respect. After the sentencing, our town didn't celebrate with loud fanfare or banners. Instead, we gathered for a quiet bonfire near the lake. Families brought snacks, neighbors shared stories, and someone set up a projector to show the documentary that aired that same night. We watched together under the stars, not for revenge, but for closure. Roy stood up at the end and raised a toast with a simple message: to standing up when it matters, even when it costs you everything. That fall, the pilot program Davis and I had discussed finally launched. I began training community liaisons from other HOAs, helping them identify early signs of abuse, teaching them how to organize, record, and protect themselves. Calls came in from California, Ohio, Florida, even Canada. What we had done in one lakeside cabin had echoed across nations. Denise took on a new role on our board, focusing on neighborhood education and inclusion. Roy was honored by the governor for his role in the reform legislation. And as for me, I kept serving as chief of police, but now with a badge that also represented a community that had faced down corruption and rebuilt itself, not with fear, but with integrity. One morning, about a year after the final sentencing, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a slip of paper that read, "You were right to stand. I wasn't strong enough, but you were." There was no name, but I recognized the handwriting. It was Brent's, and that was when I knew. Even those broken by entitlement can eventually see the light. If someone else has the courage to hold the line. This story may have started with a cabin and a birthday party, but it ended with accountability, justice, and the kind of change most people think is impossible. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, Evan, when it's hard, even when no one's backing you yet, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button now and join us at Sham Stories, where the truth always finds its way to the surface.